morning, buongiorno. So thank you for being here. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yes? Okay. So I'm Graciela Mochkofsky. I'm the Dean of the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, which is the public university in New York City. And I'm here to talk to Masha Gessen about the Russian Independent Media Archive. So Masha needs very little introduction, but I'm going to still introduce them. They are a Russian-American journalist, a staff writer with the New Yorker magazine, a prolific author, and a distinguished professor at my school, at the Newmark J School. In August, the Russian government charged them of spreading false information about the Russian armed forces under a law passed after the invasion of Ukraine that criminalized criticism of the military, and in December, the Russian government issued an arrest warrant for them. Sadly, they are not alone in this situation. So how many other journalists are in the same situation?
More than 250 people are charged with spreading false information about the Russian military. A majority of them are abroad, but several are in prison in Russia.
The charge is part of a systematic effort to crack down on critical journalism, both inside and outside of Russia. It's become practically impossible to practice independent journalism in Russia today. Hundreds have fled and live in exile, still covering their country from afar. And a vibrant journalism life is endangered. So this is what we're going to talk about today. One of Masha's most recent projects, beyond the books and the essays and the teaching, is the Russian Independent Media Archive. This is an effort to preserve the work that independent Russian journalists have been doing for more than 20 years, and it's a project based at Bard College in upstate New York in the US. So I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project, what is its status today, and what does it include?
And what was the last question?
The genesis of the project, yeah. The status today, and what it includes. What does the archive include?
So the idea for the archive really took shape during the first week of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because I was in Moscow at that moment reporting on the start of the invasion, and all the independent journalists were starting to flee the country because Russia was outlawing journalism. In the space of 1 week, it passed several laws that made it a crime to call the war a war, that made it a crime to discredit the Russian armed forces, and that made it a crime to do what I'm accused of doing, which is spread false information about the Russian military. And so it became clear to independent journalists that if they were going to cover the war, they had to leave the country. What was becoming clear to me is I was watching them leave, sometimes with one suitcase, sometimes with nothing, sometimes walking across the border to one of the Baltic countries with their dogs, that their archives were going to be in danger. And we think that the internet is forever, but it's not. It's only forever as long as somebody is paying for storage and somebody is maintaining the data in good shape. And publications in exile, publications that are losing their business models, are often not in a position to do that. Not to mention what they were physically leaving behind, often digital files and paper archives that they were leaving behind. So I was mindful of the Hannah Arendt's words that once the truth disappears, it's very hard to restore it. And I thought, we need to safeguard what's been done over the last, certainly over the last 20 plus years of Putin's rule, but also in the 1990s, sort of the entire time that free journalism has existed in Russia. And so that's how the Russian Independent Media Archive was born. We got some funding, and in cooperation with PEN America and Bard College, we're able to get it off the ground in a matter of months. At this point, we have 44 media outlets and 2.2 million articles digitized and archived and searchable.
So what was something you said when this archive was launched is that the idea was to preserve not just journalistic work and pieces and essays and coverage, but historical evidence. So I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about historical evidence of this particular period in Russian history, and what is it preserving?
Well, again, we know from history, including history that I remember, right? I remember in 1991 working as a journalist in Russia and knowing just how difficult it was to have a public conversation, but also to practice journalism, because we had no record, because we had no shared history, because we had no facts that we could all agree on. But also, since we're at a journalism conference, I think this is going to be clear to people. We also had no journalistic language. We had no practice to rely on and continue. We had to reinvent everything and rediscover everything. And I think that part of what contributed to sort of the failure of the democratic experience in Russia was that we just couldn't do it fast enough. We couldn't rediscover history and reinvent language fast enough to have a politics, right? Which journalism is essential for. And so the idea was in part to safeguard what had been created over the course of 30 plus years.
The situation, through you and through other colleagues, I've heard and I've been part of a lot of conversations with Russian journalists in exile in the past year or so or more. And there's a sense of hopelessness, at least in the immediate term, that anything will change. It looks like things are going to stay as they are and get worse. And that has led some journalists to ask, what's the point even in doing this work that you're doing? And the sense of failure that they've already recorded. And I feel a lot of journalists feel like that in the world when they cover a big historical change and things don't go as expected and democracy is lost and freedom of the press is lost. And so there's a sense of, what is the point? Why did we do this? So we recorded it, we documented it, we proved it, and still nothing changed. And the answer that this archive is providing in your words is that at least there will be a record of what happened. And so tell us a bit more of why it is important to have a record, and what can journalists do when this happens?
So that's several really interesting questions, right? There's the question of hope and hopelessness, which I think for a lot of journalists who found themselves blindsided by the full-scale invasion and having to leave the country, there's a lot of soul-searching, right? There's people are asking themselves whether what they did and what they felt good about in the years leading up to the war was actually what they should have been doing. Was practicing what they thought of as impartial journalism really the right thing? Was focusing, say, on corruption and doing investigations on corruption, was that the right thing? Right? Was there anything that journalists could have done to prevent Russia's aggression? And I don't have answers to that, but I think that there is a distinction between sort of what can be constructive soul-searching and a sense of hopelessness. Because I think that, Russian independent journalists in exile have been doing shockingly great work. It's really, their position, I know there are other panels at this festival on journalism in exile, and it's a huge and unprecedented topic at this point because so many journalists from various countries are in exile. The Russians, though, are in a particularly strange position, which is that they're trying to cover a war where they don't have access, for the most part, to either side in the war. They're trying to cover Russia waging this war against Ukraine. They're also trying to cover Ukraine, whether defending itself against Russian aggression, and most of them can't enter Ukraine either. And under these just unbelievably trying circumstances, they have been fantastically inventive. And they have done things that, that only they could do. So for example, at one point journalists for several Russian media outlets started collecting first-hand testimony about Russian war crimes. Testimony by Russian soldiers who had witnessed war crimes, and some of them had committed war crimes. This is the kind of evidence that literally no one else could have obtained. And I hope at some point this evidence is going to be used in court to try not only these individuals, but the Russian leadership for war crimes. So that's one reason we need evidence. I don't know that it's primarily the job of Russian journalists to collect evidence for war crimes trials, but I think in this situation, it may be that no one else is going to be able to do it. And then there's, of course, just the matter of having a record, right? Having a record for even if we're so hopeless, and I'm of an age where I'm leaning in that direction, this regime may not fall in my lifetime, but it will end. And when it ends, whatever is in that part of the world, whatever that country or those countries more likely are called, they're going to have to reckon with their history. And again, I think that's something that we in Russia failed to do in the 1990s for a number of reasons, but one of them, a major one, is the lack of a historical record and the lack of language and the lack of tools to use to engage in that reckoning. And I think a contemporary journalistic record, and to use a cliche, a first draft of history, could be incredibly useful and could possibly be the key to a future reckoning.
I wanted to go back to the idea of shared history and a shared truth. This is not unique of Russia today, that there's no shared sense of history within countries. And of course, it's political polarization, but we're seeing the same thing happening in many places, and how authoritarian rulers are exploiting this to divide society. Do you think a shared sense of history is possible in Russia, and how journalism, because you said this is going to help to get that?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I think that there are a lot of variables, and there are a lot of, history is unpredictable. Certainly our future is unpredictable. We can at least make a contribution to make the past a little bit less unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But, a lot of it depends on the personalities, right? Well, are there going to be leaders in a post-Putin Russia who will be able to inspire a reckoning and to lead a reckoning, right? And of course, we see the regime in the Kremlin terrified of the appearance of such leaders. I mean, they just killed Alexei Navalny because even having him in prison, for life, was too terrifying because he had that kind of force of personality that could lead that kind of reckoning, I think.
You're teaching next semester at the Newmark J School a class that is titled When We Get It Wrong, right?
Getting it wrong, yeah.
Getting it wrong. So journalists, even the best of us, and even, a lot of the efforts that you're archiving now are extraordinary good work. There's probably a lot of times in which they've gotten the story wrong. How do you see that in terms of this archive as history?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really interested in not so much why we journalists get facts wrong. Like that's everybody makes mistakes, and that's not a particularly interesting problem. But when there are stories of systematically getting a story wrong, right? And so So that course at the school is going to start with Walter Lippmann's classic essay, A Test of the News, which is a story about how the New York Times got the Russian Revolution wrong. And it's a story about not seeing what's right in front of your eyes, and a story of systematically listening to the wrong people and systematically advancing an erroneous, wishful, not fact-based narrative. I'm sure we will discover at some future point in the independent Russian media archives all kinds of examples of getting it wrong, including, for example, that Russian independent media were absolutely convinced that there was not going to be an invasion of Ukraine. And that's a classic case, right? Because the facts were in front of their eyes, in front of all of our eyes. But there were two groups of, there were two populations, and there were two groups of journalists who were convinced it wasn't going to happen. Independent Russian journalists and Ukrainian journalists. I think it's human. We can't believe things that are unbelievable, even if the evidence is before our very eyes. So in that sense, the Russian Independent Media Archive will be one of many sets of records that can contribute to studying people's failure to believe the unbelievable.
Right. So tell us a little bit more about the archive per se. So you said 44 media outlets that have shuttered. The archives are going to be accessible, that the information, the material produced by them are going to be. Why those 44? How do you decide what's part of RIMA and what's not?
So actually not all of them have been shuttered. We work with several media outlets that are very much going concerns because we want them to be safe and in proper order in case they close, but also because and this is true of all independent Russian media in exile, they're all struggling, they're all stretched, they're all underfunded. They can't necessarily maintain their archives in proper order. And digital archives are not unlike paper archives. They need to be maintained. If you just pile all the paper in a corner and you don't maintain the right temperature and you don't sort it, it's going to be unusable. So we have to maintain links, so that there are no broken links when you go to an article, so the code doesn't deteriorate, so that it's actually clear and readable, and all the links in the piece go to the right places. That's a fair amount of maintenance work that they don't necessarily have time to do, or the resources to do. And then there are a number that have in fact closed. And of course, we have to figure out what constitutes independent media. This is something that has been the subject of much conversation. There's no quantifiable way to say what independent media are. So in a way, it's a self-reinforcing mechanism. Now we're in the process of actually using the archive to create an index of independence. So we can quantify what stories, for example, are covered in a particular period in government media and stories that are covered in independent media. And by using the elisions in government media and comparing them to the presences in independent media, we can create an index of independence that we can then use to appraise the independence level of other media. So what we basically did is we started with the obvious media outlets and then broadened out a little bit, trying to maintain a balance of local, smaller media and the main, the leaders of Russian independent media such as TV Rain and Meduza. And for those that are still going concerns, we have to, of course, have agreements with them for continuing to update their archives.
And so you're going to continue adding, and where does RIMA end?
There's no end.
Okay.
No, I mean the archive. The major part of the project happened, of course, in the first year and a half, which was building the infrastructure, building some machine learning mechanisms, among other things, so that it's searchable in English, in addition to Russian. Building an interface, but the maintenance, which is updating, most of which is automated, but it also still requires some human work. And the maintenance that has to continue in perpetuity.
Another thing RIMA is doing is creating a toolkit, you call it, and this might be very relevant for people here, because I know there are journalists in exile here and people who are, also trying to preserve work in countries where freedom of the press is either in danger or gone. You're helping others to create their own archives. And the first, you started with Guatemala and with El Periódico, creating an archive of this independent newspaper and digital news organization in Guatemala that was shattered, and its publisher is still in prison, Chepe Zamora. And so the second archive that is part of this effort is the archival of El Periódico. So, two questions there. One, that this specific case and why this paper and where is that at? And two, why create a toolkit to expand this to other countries?
So the idea from the very beginning was that Russia is, while in some ways unique, and in some ways, and I think this is important to the project, is ground zero for autocratic repression of the media, right? For a lot of countries, looking at Russia actually is very informative, because we know, we learn a lot about how, and even to some extent why, right, media get repressed and shut down. But the other thing was that obviously I'm Russian, the team is Russian, and so we started with the Russian media, but from the very beginning we wanted to make a toolkit available to journalists from other countries, that and the whole idea was that the position that Russian journalists found themselves in was catastrophic and sudden. Mm-hmm. So there had been gradual repression, and suddenly they had to flee. Suddenly they were in a completely unfamiliar situation, and predictably that happens to journalists all the time, everywhere. Is that they have catastrophic events. And so we wanted to build a thing that you can sort of jump onto during catastrophic change in a country, to make sure that its independent media are safe and cannot be deleted from the web or destroyed in the mess and violence of whatever is happening in the country. And so El Periódico came to us. They came to us for advice, because their situation was sort of exactly what we had in mind. They had been deleted from the web, but everything had been downloaded. Mm-hmm. So they had the archive, but it needed to be restored and sort of cleaned up and maintained and made accessible, restored to the state of a living periodical, even if it's no longer functioning. And we were able to offer them more than advice. We were able to offer them the entire toolkit. So that's getting off the ground now. And of course, because the initial infrastructure for the Russian Independent Media Archive was quite an expensive undertaking, but the Guatemalan Independent Media Archive is going to cost about 10% of that, because everything is in place.
Right. So for those in the audience who might sadly need to start their own independent media archive, or who think that this is something that they might need in the future, or they want to start building it because there's danger, how does one go about it? How much funding do you need to pay for what? You just mentioned technology, which is clearly the highest, the biggest cost. And would you say that an affiliation with an institution is necessary? Because this doesn't need to be done at BART, where you are, right? So there's people from all over the world here.
Well, I mean, I find that being part of an academic institution makes a kind of intuitive sense, because where else are you going to put an archive? You want people to be using it. We want, we've talked a lot about how it's going to be important and useful at the end of the Putin regime. But we don't want it just sitting there until Putin dies or loses power. We want this thing to be living, and we want researchers and students to be using it constantly. And that's already happening with the Russian Independent Media Archive. We have one researcher who is writing a book about the ideology of Putinism and using the archive. We have, I'm advising a graduate student who is looking at the transformation of language used in the coverage of LGBTQ issues around the time of the passage of anti-propaganda laws, so-called in 2013 and then again in 2020, 2021. And it's fascinating to have the data at your fingertips to be able to do this. And this is, by the way, this reminds me of another reason for the archive. Media that still exist and try to have a foothold in Russia have had to go back and delete things from their archives. So when Russia outlawed coverage of LGBT issues altogether, when it made it a crime to even say LGBT except in a highly negative context, semi-independent media or media that have a history of independence, because there's also that category, they went back and deleted everything. But we saved it. So for future historians and for contemporary researchers, it's essential. So I happen to be in favor of having it be part of an academic institution, because I think it can produce a lot of research. But it's not, it's obviously not a requirement. And so I think, what you do if you find yourself in a catastrophic situation is you come to us, you figure out a way to use the technology that we've already developed so that it costs less. And then, it depends on the volume of data that needs to be saved.
Who's paying for this?
We have had a very generous support from the Barbie Family Foundation, which is Peter Barbie, an American entrepreneur and philanthropist. And then we've raised smaller amounts of money through BARD.
Great. So I'm going to ask a final question, so please think. We're going to have 15 minutes for Q&A, so of course, Masha wants to answer your questions, so please start thinking and raise your hands after this last question. A final point that I want you to talk about, because this is something you have discussed a lot and is part of the core of this project, is the idea of this archive as resistance, which you touch on a little bit, but not. So can you expand on that and the idea of resistance and this as a political act?
Well, I mean, I think that journalism is a political act, and I think when you live in an autocratic country, you become very aware of it, and you don't sort of fall on cliches about being apolitical and impartial. So autocracies depend on lies, and they depend on, in large part, on telling lies about the past, especially contemporary autocracies. They all traffic in past-oriented politics. They all, all contemporary autocrats promise to take their countries to some sort of imaginary past. And maintaining an accurate, factual, detailed, textured record of the past, to me, is one of the ultimate acts of resistance.
Right. Thank you. So questions over there?
Yes. I think it's still good morning, I'm not sure. Thank you for the talk. I cannot help but keep thinking about all the parallels when you're describing, journalists working in Russia and all the repression, but thinking about Palestinian journalists in Gaza and Palestine, And I thank you for the article you wrote in The Shadow of the Holocaust. For whoever did not read it, please go ahead and read it. So I was just wondering, with all the lashback you have received writing this article, what is your advice for Western journalists to keep talking about the war in Gaza and not succumb to the censorship and all the pressure and the importance of having that voices reach outside the Arab region? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've just come back from Israel-Palestine, so, and obviously some of the reporting that I did there was trying to look at media, and it's a really disheartening, horrible situation. I'm going to say all the obvious things about how dangerous it's been for people to cover Gaza, how unconscionable the restrictions on entering Gaza have been, how difficult it's been to report. But you know, one of the other things that that I was struck by when I was there was this apparent consensus in Israeli media, which is not forced on them by the state, but they just, with the small, notable, very important, but insufficient exception of Haaretz, they live in October 7th, and they are the major contributor to this growing gap between Jewish and Palestinian Israelis who live in completely different media realities, right? My Palestinian friends say that they wake up, they check Al Jazeera, they check whether their families are alive, they look at Telegram channels, they're completely living this war that has been going on for more than 6 months. And my Jewish Israeli friends are living in October 7th in some way or another. And even if they're not, they're certainly not seeing what's happening in Gaza. I don't know that I have any advice, but I certainly think if there's any way to call on Israeli journalists who still have the freedom to do this, nobody's making them restrict themselves to this kind of coverage. How do we get them to step up and show their fellow citizens what's going on right across the border in Gaza?
Good morning. Like you said, many independent Russian journalists are exiled or can go back to Russia, can go to Ukraine. So how does one operate from the outside, like when someone is not where the action is taking place? Thank you.
You have to be incredibly inventive, which they have been. So some media outlets have, some media outlets still have reporters in Russia. It's very dangerous to collaborate with independent media while in Russia, so there are various ways to anonymize or distribute reporting. And I'm not going to go into more detail on that for obvious reasons. And then they also use technology, they use social media, they use hotlines, tip lines. Particularly at times of crisis, tip lines have been incredibly useful. And crowdsourced journalism, the most recent example probably would be the funeral of Alexei Navalny, when tens of thousands of people risk their lives, literally risk their lives to go to a funeral. And then of those people, quite a large number also took the risk of filming and uploading their footage to Telegram channels or through other means, contributing it to independent media in exile, which were then able to compile it and have something that came very close to reported eyewitness reports based on sort of assembling from these fragments and, that were crowdsourced. And then, some of the reporting that they've been able to do, starting with tip lines, has been absolutely amazing. Like I mentioned earlier, these confessions, right, where they have, TV Rain, for example, has asked people to tell them anything that they know about the conditions of Russian military in Ukraine, and then have gotten those people to talk, sometimes on camera, about what they witnessed and sometimes about what they did. And that's, it's shocking reporting and invaluable evidence.
Thank you for your project. I think it's really important for the global community and for justice. And you've mentioned that the only work that Russian journalists, independent journalists can do is to gather testimonies, but there are several projects that done this work. For example, I think you know the Reconin project, and that's only the one of them. And I think that really, really important work that only Russian independent journalists can do is to shape opinion inside Russian community, because huge part of Russian society still supports this cruel Russian aggression. And how do you think, how is it possible to shape this opinion to stop this public support of war, or at least to decrease this support?
So yeah, I think the Reckoning Project is obviously, it's this terrific Ukrainian project that has been instrumental in getting evidence of Russian war crimes both into Western and Ukrainian media and to courts. I think that what Russians can do that Ukrainians can't do is exactly what I was describing, which is getting Russians to give testimony. Right? I don't want to overestimate what independent media can do to change opinion. I don't know that that's actually possible. What I think they can do is maintain a lifeline for a minority of Russians who want to have accurate information and who don't support the war. Right? I don't want to claim that people who support the war are going to be willing to pay the psychic price of changing their opinions. If you're living in a totalitarian society, the chances that watching independent Russian television is going to sway you are extremely slim, partly because you're not going to watch independent Russian television. But that said, for Russian media in exile, such as TV Rain, such as Medusa, the bulk of their readers and viewers are still in Russia, right? So these are people who are resourceful enough to keep using virtual private networks or apps that allow them to circumvent Russia's blocking of these websites. And of course, Russia hasn't yet blocked YouTube. I'm sure it's a matter of time, but for now, it's a very important outlet for these independent media. And so however many people there are, and it's a small minority, but it's not a small number. We're talking about millions of people, right, who are still depending on independent journalism to stay sane and to stay informed. So that, I think, is the most important mission. That may not be as ambitious as we would like, but I think it's realistic, and I think it's very important.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, you were talking about this idea that it's not necessarily the role of journalists to collect evidence for war crimes. Can you expand on that a little bit more and talk about how, like, accountability journalism, like the importance of that, and how that may or may not play into international justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm just being aware of the limitations of journalism, and obviously there are projects like the Reckoning Project that sort of straddle the border between journalism and actual evidence collection. But these are two different projects, right? Partly the difference is simply that for a legal case, you generally need exhaustive evidence. You don't want exhaustive evidence in a story. That's really, really boring and repetitive, right? And that's, you know, that's not what journalism is for. Or journalism is to inform large groups of the public. Right? Large groups of the public don't need to know every single piece of legal evidence that should be usable in court. There are other issues as well, right? I think, and this is actually going back, this is something that I'm very interested in these days, but going back to Israel-Palestine, right? I think there are certain things that just can't be done well in journalistic time and by journalistic means, such as covering the use of sexual violence in war. Right? A lot of the time, journalists are simply not trained to get that kind of testimony. And when they try, they can do a lot of damage. Again, there are exceptions. I know that people in the Reckoning Project have received very good training on how to interview victims of war crimes. But for your standard reporter who is trying to get something on air or in the paper in the space of 24 hours or maximum several weeks, that's just, you know, there's a lot of stuff that they're not equipped to collect, and we don't want them to be collecting that kind of evidence that can actually do quite a bit of damage.
We can take one last brief question, and then we're going to wrap up. All right.
That's a lot of pressure on this one person.
Right. Okay. Oh, somebody over there. Abigail.
Thank you both for being here. Question for you, Masha. It seems like since the war on terror, we're living in a world of internets, where you have specific types of internet and people have access to different types of information. Trump may be reelected next year. What are some things that journalists who have probably grown used to their freedom of speech, their right to using a number of different terms to describe things, what can they do to be more vigilant about potentially slides into autocratic ways of running the internet?
Yeah, I don't know that my answer is going to be specific to the internet, but I think that I'll actually pick up on a couple of things that have come up in the last hour. One is that journalists, and I think there are good reasons for this, right? But, sort of institutional and structural reasons. Journalists sometimes have a tendency to fall in line when it's not necessary, when nobody's making us do it. We saw this during Trump's presidency. I don't want to say the first Trump presidency, but you know, we saw how difficult it was to cover it without normalizing it. And in fact, on the whole, it's probably impossible. How do you cover something that is happening every day that is in fact, in the short term, the normal without normalizing it? It's impossible. So you can try to be mindful of how impossible it is and try to moderate the normalization, right? Which means a lot of sort of intentional use of words and a lot of problematizing things that we shouldn't be accepting so readily. Right? So that's sort of on the level of specific stories, and then there are things like the sort of the larger picture, which I was just talking about, answering the question about Israel-Palestine. Right? Why are Israeli media so useful to their right-wing government? Why don't they ask themselves what else they should be covering to make themselves less useful and more problematic. That's certainly something that we should be asking ourselves if Trump gets elected.
Thank you so much, Masha.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.